Welcome to the Naavik Gaming Podcast, where it is our mission to explore the business and future of video games. We bring together the industry's brightest builders, investors, and thinkers to keep a pulse on current events, dissect emerging trends in games, share lessons learned, and have a great time. This podcast is also part of Naavik's growing ecosystem, which ranges from free and premium research to consulting and advisory services. For more information, visit www.naavik.co. This episode is brought to you by Nexus. Building a support a creator program is something all live service game developers should be doing. But without the right engineering bandwidth or marketing expertise, doing so can be a challenge. Nexus's creator program in a box makes it easy for game devs to build and manage world-class creator programs, driving significant growth in conversion, ARPU, retention, and LTV. Nexus has partnered with incredible live service publishers like Capcom, Grinding Gear Games, Hi-Rez, Ninja Kiwi, and more, and would love to help you, our Naavik Gaming Podcast listeners, do the same. If interested in learning more, simply head to nexus.gg/Naavik. There, you can learn more about the efficacy of support a creator programs and discover how to easily build your own. Again, that's nexus.gg/Naavik, or check out the link in the show notes. And with that, let's jump into the episode. Hi, everyone. I'm your host, Aaron Bush, and I am delighted to be joined today by Dylan Collins. Dylan is a serial entrepreneur in the games industry, having founded companies like DemonWare, Jolt, and SuperAwesome, all of which had successful exits. Today, he's an investor, writer, reader, and someone I've enjoyed learning from. So I'm thrilled to have him on the show. Today, we'll focus the conversation mostly on entrepreneurship, kid tech, and Dylan's budding interest in user-generated content. So with all of that said, Dylan, welcome to the Naavik Gaming Podcast.
Hey, Aaron. It's great to be here. Long-time listener. Huge fan of what you guys do. So it's cool to be able to chat.
Well, this is going to be a lot of fun, and I appreciate you saying that. So we have a lot to get to, but probably the best place to start is just for you to catch us up to speed on what all you have done in the games industry over the past 20 or so years. So I mentioned 3 of your companies in that intro, but can you tell us a little bit more about your entrepreneurial journey until now?
I shall do my best to try to answer that in as few a set of words as I can. So I co-founded DemonWare back in university with Sean Blanchfield. That was when we were spending more time playing Counter-Strike than we were going to lectures. It was like in the early 2000s. It was just sort of at the dawn of multiplayer gaming. We sort of we felt that this was going to be a thing that would be more popular rather than less. It seems kind of very obvious now, sort of 20 years later. So we built a company developing, I suppose, what was then called middleware, which was essentially a set of tools to make it easier for game studios to produce multiplayer games. So it was all around the matchmaking community, lobby, eventually into the state propagation side of things. And that company was ultimately acquired by Activision, became part of the Call of Duty stack. And I believe, in fact, I know, DemonWare celebrated its 20th birthday, I think this year or last year.
Wow.
Because they sent me a lovely poster, which was very nice of them. And that's kind of where it all began. So after that, we co-founded Jolt, which was at the time sort of looking at the emerging social game space. And we started bringing some IPs. We started licensing some IPs to produce social games. That got acquired by GameStop. So I spent a little bit of time in what was then the biggest games retailer in the world as they discovered the internet, which was around about 2010, and worked with their team to buy up a few other digital companies. And then co-founded SuperAwesome with a collection of amazing co-founders in 2013, which was focused on building digital tools to help content owners and brands with young audiences I was acquired by Epic Games a couple of years ago. Oh, by the way, notable shout out to an amazing marketing services agency called Potato, which I was chairman of, somewhere in between all of that, which got acquired by WPP. So I think the short version is I have never had a proper job and I am utterly unemployable. And building companies and helping people build companies is sort of what I do and love.
I love that. And in a moment, I want to ask you just some lessons you've learned from each of those companies. But first, I just kind of want to ask, why have all of your companies been so successful? Like, you don't miss is kind of what it looks like. Is there any like pattern to like what you've done as a founder or how you've started these companies that has made them all win?
I mean, I suppose like there's lots of iterations behind the scenes, when we've built all of these companies. I mean, my philosophy is broadly twofold, which is try to understand what is going to be obviously true about the future and try to avoid doing anything stupid related to getting there. And that tends to filter out a lot of different things, which leaves you with a very short list of what you might do about a trend that you believe to be true in the future. So like with DemonWare, we were very, very, very convinced that the future was going to be multiplayer rather than sort of single player experiences. And with SuperAwesome, the view was that, hey, there are going to be more kids online rather than less kids online. And I think it's trying to be fairly ruthless about that intellectually when you sort of go at these things and not let ego get in the way and not let confirmation bias get in the way and really try and find lots of people to tell you that you are wrong or you are an idiot or some combination of those things. It's easy to say and hard to do, but that's kind of the approach.
Yeah, and what are a couple examples of what you mean by just like avoid being stupid? Like, what has that meant for you as an entrepreneur?
I think it's sort of looking, very closely or as close as you can at like business models at like, when you see a new space emerging, trying to understand like, what are the components of that new space which are going to maintain value, what are the components which might very, very easily be commoditized. You can, I mean, to sort of generalize an example, I mean, you can build something that will be completely free and that will be very, very popular, but is that really going to be sustainable? Like, obviously on the consumer side of things, maybe it is if you plug some ads in. On the enterprise thing, maybe less so. And I suppose it is just sort of trying to, think through what could be potentially robust as an opportunity to build. Sometimes a lot of the time that kind of proxies out to trying to build the hardest thing rather than the easiest thing. Usually because you sort of get an interesting sort of selection bias that sort of happens there. But I think, you look at sort of everything we've seen over the last couple of years as the world, and particularly venture-backed companies, kind of reset to, there's this thing called EBITDA. And, people realizing, you mean like we do actually have to be profitable at some point. And I sort of track that back to sort of first principles along the lines of like, okay, you can build a thing to solve for an opportunity, but like ultimately you do have to make it a viable business. And even if you don't necessarily have to get to that stage for when you're potentially acquired or go public or something like that, you do have to have a path there. And I think it's kind of easy to get very excited by an opportunity without sort of thinking through that stuff. So I guess those are the kinds of things that kind of define avoiding stupidity or trying either stupid stuff or stuff that's just way, way, way too hard to figure out.
Yeah.
I don't know. I like to win, and thus I like high probability, which people say it makes me very boring, but I don't know. I guess it also makes us historically right most of the time. So I don't know.
I think that's a good way to look at it. And there are certainly a lot of ways to be stupid. Many of which I've probably learned the hard way at this point. And maybe you have too, which kind of brings me to my next question, which is, could you just share one memorable lesson that you learned as a founder from each of the call it like those three main companies that you founded. What did you learn along the way?
I mean, to be clear, I think I have compounded stupidity over the years with all of the companies. Like it's this is not like my aspiration to avoid it is from experience in living through it. So I think that's where that kind of wisdom comes from. I think like I thought this was an interesting question. I mean, and I would say like I picked like some quite specific lessons from each of the companies, but like with DemonWare, like we got acquired by Activision very very early on, and I think most people would agree. Certainly, Sean and I, looking way back now, like we sold way too early, and I think with a lot of first time founders, which we were, like you see an acquisition inbound, and you sort of think, right, great, we have arrived. When really, like, a conversation about an acquisition is just simply a signal that you're doing the right thing and you should probably keep doing it. It is like the earliest signal of long term success. And a lot of people sort of react to that as being sort of, a signal to immediately leave what you're doing. Right. So, we that company was acquired really at the very beginning of its journey. I think with Jolt, like one of the most interesting lessons there was when we had been acquired by GameStop, which was at the time, this was like 2010, 11, thereabouts. And at the time, GameStop, biggest video games retailer in the world, heavily shorted company. There was probably about a quarter of the free float shorted at any one point. So they were always under tremendous pressure, and they sort of acquired us and a few other companies to roll out a digital strategy. And I think we realized that, like, my learning from it was like, unless sort of, the compensation structure, the incentive model at executive level is actually based on the thing you're trying to change, it's probably not going to change. So we rolled out some really cool stuff in GameStop and integrated like user acquisition system with their point of sale. And the whole thing kind of got closed down after a quarter, which was kind of nuts. But again, looking back, you can sort of understand like the motivations back in there. And then I think in SuperAwesome, like, it was, we knew we had the power of mathematics on our side, to what I said earlier, right? Like we built that company on the basis that there were going to be more kids spending more time online, which was, one of the greatest one-way bets, I think, in living history. And, we got to a point where we kind of realized we were right. And that in that situation, like all you have to do is just not die, right? Which is every startup's remit and every founder team's remit. But like, it is still sort of a thing that we actually realized that like, that we had done the hard part by identifying the opportunity and being there. Now we just had to make sure we could survive long enough to do it. I would say that like the other lesson, particularly from SuperAwesome, is that like just how much in general investors undervalue amazing sales teams. I think that's, when you look at sort of the general kind of startup ecosystem of writing, people talk about 10x engineers and people talk about product managers and everything else. And there's not enough people talking about like sales teams. Like, Lee Veach was one of our co-founders, and he really sort of built and led the sales DNA in there. And SuperAwesome would not have been successful, without him and without that team. And I think we built a bunch of very interesting technology around that as well, but that was really at the core of it. And, I do feel, having been in some organizations that value engineers significantly more than salespeople, I do think that is still one of the greatest sort of, disservices to a profession that the technology world has had over the last few years.
Those are really great answers. I'm glad that you spent some time thinking of them. Those are really thoughtful. And I kind of want to follow that up. And some of that was reflective of like the exit events in some cases. And obviously you've spent time as a founder like on your own in your company, but you also did spend time inside of these larger organizations. And so I'm curious to maybe learn even more about what that experience was like for you, who, as you said, you're kind of unemployable, in that kind of structure. But then two, just like, what have you learned besides aligning incentives about how to better embed startup teams into larger companies to better set them up for success?
I mean, I think there's a general rule with big companies that they all think they want to have founders in their midst until they realize what they have actually done. It's kind of one of those things where, you think you're being locked in a room with me, whereas actually it's the other way around. And I mean, it's interesting when you look back at the three companies, right? Because, when you look at sort of Jolt, DemonWare, SuperAwesome, like, one is still going today. One was closed down pretty shortly after. And one is sort of partially being spun out at the moment. So we've kind of been through the full spectrum of kind of outcomes on this. I think there's a few lessons in there. I mean, these are probably very, very obvious things, but I guess for anyone listening who sort of hasn't been through acquisitions before, I mean, I think fundamentally you need to absolutely make sure that you have a champion in the acquiring company. And to the acquiring company, make sure you have a champion, like someone who is actually accountable for this, as opposed to a corp dev team that's just running it. Like, if there is not a single identifiable person who is the champion of this deal, I think there's a very high probability, it will fall apart after the deal is done, if it doesn't fall apart before the deal gets done. I think, agreeing, again, very, very obvious stuff, like agreeing an integration plan, and actually making sure that's transparent to everyone on both sides. It's amazing in big companies, where acquisitions can happen and you're walking into meetings and like everyone has no idea who you are, or worse, why you're there. And I think just sort of the transmission of all of that is kind of critical. I think the thing that, and anyone who's been acquired will relate to this, that like will realize that you should assume as a founder, like, that your average unit of productivity will massively decrease, right? So like, if you think like your average unit of getting things done is like a day or a week or something like that, it will change to like probably at least a month, and maybe more likely a quarter. Like, especially if the company's public, that will be your sort of your average unit of productivity in terms of getting anything done, right? So I think those are kind of general points to founders. I think for like, if I was on the acquiring side, like, I think there's probably a couple of things. One is, I mean, this is a little bit subtle, but like, I've seen companies through our experiences, but also elsewhere, like, they try and kind of redeploy these sort of generalist leaders on the executive team. And maybe it's the founders, or maybe it's part of the leadership team. And they try and deploy these sort of generalists into like domain specialist roles based on what the company did. And you sort of, you take people who've been running teams of like 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 people, and you're kind of trying to redeploy them into, hey, do this really, really specific thing. And they're used to operating with the team and an apparatus. And they're almost kind of being told, hey, go and build some spreadsheets, or go and build some slides, right? And I think that's a little bit of that is a challenge, I think, for everyone involved, and people get quite confused. And I think it's back to sort of, the point about having an integration plan. I also think, like, when it comes to the founders themselves, I mean, there's different schools of thoughts on it's like, hey, you must keep the founders, to no, you should probably try and offboard them as quickly as you can. I think, like, however you think about that, you should definitely spend the time to really understand, like, the motivations, and probably most importantly, the energy of the founders. Like, if you're acquiring a company like who've been going for like 15 years, like, I can probably tell you what the energy of the founders is like, right? Whereas if they've been going like 5 years or 6 years, like, it might be in a good and interesting place. And I think it's like, again, it's a very subjective thing about trying to understand people's energy, but it really, 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 really matters. Like, usually people who build things want to continue building things, and they don't like impediments being put in their way. And they can be huge, like, they can be really value additive, even to big companies, if you give them the right circumstances and the right tools and the right frameworks to go and operate. But you need to spend the time to go and understand what they want and how they're feeling. And I think sometimes people either don't know how to have that conversation, or maybe kind of afraid to have it. But I think one day I will probably write a very long blog post about this.
Please do.
It could even be a book, but it won't be a book, to be clear. It will just be a blog post.
Are there any companies in or around the games industry that you've observed or you think do like a particularly good job at acquiring that have like the infrastructure, the right motivations, incentives to be good at it, or do you think that it's just a kind of a struggle no matter where you are?
I think it's always hard for some reason, whether it's on the founder side or the buyer side. I mean, if I look across the industry and I sort of think about conversations people have had, I mean, I think there is an interesting distinction, at least, between acquirers that are still founder led versus acquirers that are like what I would call kind of professional management led. So like in Epic, for example, like it's still led by Tim Sweeney. The DNA around, hey, let people kind of get on with what they're doing, like keep it pretty flat, don't impose a whole bunch of sort of admin and infrastructure on them, like is pretty clear. I mean, you've got companies like Microsoft, that are also very practical about acquiring, in terms of being able to onboard people and really having amazing sort of onboarding sort of systems and structures for that. So I think it's like, it is. I would probably look around at who is the highest frequency of acquisition, because at least then you've got there's clearly, they're seeing enough volume to generate lessons and learn them. So I think those two would probably come to mind. I mean, I got to say, like, full credit to Activision for making the success of DemonWare that they did. Like in any sector, video games anywhere, like for something to still be going 20 years after its not after its acquisition, probably like what 15, 12, 14 years after its acquisition. Like that's pretty remarkable. And I think companies are probably getting better at it. And I think particularly now that you've got like, more big companies that are being run by serial entrepreneurs, serial founders, I think that is starting to give a lot more empathy to acquisitions, in terms of like how to onboard them. I mean, I think it's probably too early to call what Embracer is going to look like in terms of a good or bad acquirer. I mean, they've certainly done it by volume, but
I think we have an answer to that.
Well, the share price perhaps suggests, but we'll see. It is a very, very interesting topic, and I still don't think I don't think investors talk about it enough, actually. And I think that typically in corporates, the people who are involved with it aren't able to talk about it much publicly because their comms teams prevent them.
Yeah, there's a lot of that, and companies with different motivations too. And as we see more consolidation in the industry, whether it's around like big platform ecosystems forming, or those growth by acquisition companies, etc. I don't know how. I guess you could see more acquisitions, but probably fewer great ones unless they truly are in like a more decentralized kind of way, which even that I guess can not always work out the best. And you see companies like Embracer kind of change from being as decentralized to needing to step in, and that kind of changes their identity and just the role of what acquisitions even look like and if they make sense anymore.
I think like there is generally not enough thought given to acquisitions, and I do mean that on both sides. And because again, like the all the roll up plays are fundamentally doing it for an industrial logic, which is kind of coming down to EBITDA, right? And to some degree, like even though those are probably the least personal acquisition machines, at least you sort of know what you're getting, and everyone can be pretty clear on metrics and what success does and doesn't look like. If you're being acquired by, be like it was an acquisition machine. I mean, WPP on the advertising side is still an acquisition machine and just buying and buying and buying lots and lots of agencies, and they've got a very, very straightforward model for that. Whereas I think that like if when you're buying for sort of strategy, whether it's market expansion or product or something like that, I really think you have to get into like the deep humanity of the thing to make sure people are aligned. Like people talk about values alignment and everyone kind of eye rolls. But like the more I see of this stuff, like the more I kind of bring it back to that. Like, you know what I mean? If you're not genuinely thinking about the same thing, it doesn't really matter how much money you throw at people. Like, you will see discord emerge, at some point down the line. People will get frustrated or annoyed, or they won't understand why a strategy is being followed. So yeah, I think I mean, this is kind of an obvious thing to say, but I think you will continue to see both good and bad acquisitions over time. That would be my very easy prediction.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, let's go ahead and switch gears and talk about kid tech, which is the latest industry that your entrepreneurial path took you down with SuperAwesome. And I think a good place to start for this conversation would just be for you to describe what you perceive the current state of kid tech to be, especially around online games. Like, what's your view of that market and reality right now?
My view and the reality, yes. That's an interesting contrast. I mean, I would say, like, look, over the course of the last decade, there's, when you look at specifically around sort of gaming, I guess, but you can probably call it consumer services. There's probably been, I don't know, maybe like 3 or 4 phases that everyone has gone through. Like, phase 1 was like everyone put up an age gate and then kind of ignored everything. Phase 2 was everyone then added parental consent to be compliant with laws like COPPA, and then also kind of ignored everything else. And then sort of phase 3, which I would argue is probably only started in the last 2 to 3 years, was like everyone sort of did all of that, but then has started to think like much more deeply like about young audiences and young audience engagement and like, you've seen things emerge like, age verification, locked features, cabin mode. I can go into a bit more detail on those if people are interested. And I think phase 4, which is somewhere in the future, is where you somehow, and there is some magic included in this description for now, like that young audiences have like total feature parity, right, with older audiences. And I think, like, so we have moved from tick box to actual thought being given, but there are still lots of interesting challenges remaining here, for interesting technical and psychological reasons.
Yeah, the checkbox era was a funny one. I think that's. I remember that just like even at myself as a kid. I'm like, well, this doesn't do anything because you just say your birthday is a different time or just hit no and and you're good. It wasn't really kid tech as you've pioneered it, as we'll see into the future.
I mean, when we started SuperAwesome and like, SuperAwesome was a result of like many failures, and one of which was the utter failure to raise external investment. When we went out relatively early, 2013, 14, to the Valley to pitch everyone with what we thought was an extremely straightforward pitch. It's like, hey, there are more kids on the internet. There are these laws coming down the line. You are going to need more tools. And absolutely everyone went, no, it's fine. They tick a box. We're good. and that was like, I cannot tell you how many meetings I got politely escorted from, where investors just didn't think this was going to need any capital. So yeah, it is fascinating and I think generally good about like how things have evolved since then.
Yeah, I don't totally understand that. So maybe you can unpack that a bit more. I guess surely there's more reason to investors not being interested, the market not being larger, it being kind of difficult to raise money than just the fact that there's like, you can type in your age. Like, are there other structural reasons or motivations to why this market has not been able to become larger or raise as much money as maybe it should have?
I mean, I think there have been sort of a handful of challenges that the space has gone through. Like, I mean, I think, like, first of all, it is a pretty sizable market. So, I mean, to say that it's kind of broken from an investor point of view is probably not super accurate, right? I mean, I think like we've seen now in the last 2-3 years, a range of sort of multi-$100 million and $1 billion outcomes, right? Whether it's SuperAwesome or Moonbug or Roblox or Epic Learning, sorry. But I think that like the big challenge for investors has always been, and I'm going to just sort of skip around advertising for a second because I will come back to that. The big challenge for investors has always been like, okay, how do you build a revenue model around this investment, right? Because nobody wants to utter the line, how do kids make money for us, right? And it's that awkwardness, I think, that has sort of deflected a lot of investor interest from the space. Whereas the reality is that like kids and teens, and I mean, this is true for everything up to under 16 in terms of where where the definition sort of lies here. Like, they are fully fledged internet citizens with their own independent payment cards, and they will go and spend money. And like, so the notion that sort of people wouldn't treat them seriously is always kind of struck me as short-sighted. So I think like, you sort of, because you kind of had that disconnect between the clear identification of the audience, but that lack of sort of forthrightness about the economics. I just think it became a struggle for investors, and I think that was somewhat amplified, certainly in the early days. I go back to 2013, 2014, by the fact that like none of the big platforms seemed to be taking this seriously, right? So that was all, sort of it became a little bit of an echo chamber, I think. But I do think like that has changed quite a bit. I mean, you now have like, when you look at sort of the total amount of investment dollars going into the kid tech space, and by that I mean like tools to help engagement or to provide engagement with young audiences, but also what's called safety tech, which sort of is what it sounds like, which is, tools for moderation and community toxicity and things like that. You've got somewhere like about $200 million a year being invested there. But that's normalized. So it's actually more over the last couple of years. Versus, again, you go back 10 years and it was approximately zero. So I think you are gradually starting to see more investor interest in the space. Nothing drives it like successful outcomes, as you know. So, I mean, undoubtedly, in fact, I know for a fact, like when you look at sort of the big outcomes, you just like Moonbug, SuperAwesome, Roblox, like there are lots of people going around right now pitching, the next generation version of Moonbug, SuperAwesome, and Roblox, right? Which is good. It's great.
Yeah.
It sort of spawns more optimism.
Yeah, that is good. So I'm curious then, what would you say are the big problems left to solve in kid tech, or are the big problems left to solve in this upcoming era that you foresee kind of, being shuffled in? Obviously, I mean, it could be a long answer, but
let me actually be helpful, because I did actually write a blog post about this, which also ended up being quite a long blog post.
It's a good one,
but thank you. I would say like the top 3 problems broadly for sort of young audiences and digital engagement, so it's very applicable to the game ecosystem, is probably one, like sustainable, like commercially sustainable kids app stores. Like, you still have a situation today where like developers building titles for young audiences are still highly incentivized to not be in the kids and family category, because again, there's commercial restrictions there. And again, there's a distinction here between sort of being commercial and, exploiting. And, you need to have like a viable kids developer industry, very, very simply. And I still don't think, people running various app stores around the world quite gotten their heads around that. I think one of the other things that still hasn't been solved is like the challenge for parental involvement with with kids, whether they're playing games or using any sort of service. And like, we've now seen huge amounts of investment into parent tools. You see it at the console level, you see it at the game level, but like parents are still confused, don't have time, don't care, don't know where to go. Like there isn't really like a trusted digital brand for parents that seems to really exist yet. I mean, maybe it's Netflix or Disney or something, but no one is the whole sort of making it easier for parents to do this stuff, which again is part technology, part psychology. That still isn't solved really meaningfully. And then I would say the third one, and my favorite one to talk for hours about, is the need for like some sort of universal age API. Like the biggest issue we have is today around this whole challenge of kids using services designed for adults is that like age gates are probably the most powerful incentive to lie that our civilization has developed. Like, I mean, to your example, right? Like it's
I still lie
like,
on those. Yeah.
Like, hey, here's the thing. Tell us something about yourself, and here's what you can't get if you tell us the truth. It's remarkable, and it's. I mean, this sort of wades very quickly into notions of like privacy and safety, and like lots of very serious internet people get angry about this topic. But like, I do think the only way to sort of make this easier for developers and platforms everywhere is where you have some sort of source of truth for date of birth, which I don't know whether it comes ultimately from sort of operating systems or phone activate or device activation or something like that. This is a technically solvable thing, like quite easily. But I do think, I think the challenge is probably the economics of it. Like going back to your point on investors, like, well, can you really build this into a venture sized business? No, you probably can't. Maybe you can, but it's still definitely a thing that needs to be solved, and everyone wants this to be solved. I think that's yeah. Clearly, I would talk about this for a long time.
So, out of what you just said, what are you most optimistic about improving over the next few years?
I think, like, when you look back at what has changed, like, because again, I get cornered by various people like around the world, and they sort of say, okay, like billions of dollars have been invested in things, game platforms, streaming. Why is the internet still more or less a dumpster fire for kids? And it's like, well, actually, behind the scenes, I mean, this and this and this and this, and they're kind of looking at you, going, "Yeah, but we don't care. It's still like a bit of a mess." But so, I think, I am reasonably optimistic about the future. Like, when you look at the amount, as I said, of capital that's going into the space, like, you've got $200 million a year that is being invested into things like kid tech and safety tech. Like, you have. When you look at sort of what the average digital consumer service, whether it's a game or streaming or anything like that, looks like for a kid today versus what it looked like 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, it's night and day, right? In terms of support and features and everything else. Like, you look at sort of the success of Roblox, you look at what like Fortnite is doing, you look at sort of the commitments Lego are making into the space. I mean, I think, when you sort of you look at things like, I talked about sort of age verification based features. When I looked at sort of like, I think what Epic, I mean, I'm slightly biased here, but like what Epic did with cabin accounts, right? Which was like, hey, okay, if a child ages as sort of under 13 or under whatever the age is, you're not blocking them from absolutely everything. You're giving them access to some functionality to get them involved in the ecosystem. That's the kind of thoughtful thinking, that I feel you need a bit more of, and you are seeing more of, and I think you will see that get rolled out more and more by a lot of. I mean, I know a lot of the big game developers who haven't announced things are going to be announcing things over the next sort of year or so, like around support for young audiences. So it is definitely getting better, and somehow someone will solve the universal age API thing. I it might take more than 5 years, but it definitely won't take more than 10 years. That is my bet with you, Aaron.
Great. That's great if that happens. I'd definitely root for it. Final question on this topic before we move on, and tying it back more directly into just the games industry and all the leaders and people from those companies who are listening. What should more games teams be doing regarding kid tech that maybe most teams are not doing today, or that they just need to keep an eye on over the next couple of years for like these new improvements to come that they should start embedding soon?
I mean, I think everyone probably underestimates just how disruptive the audience you're talking about is going to be for absolutely everyone, like game developers across the board. Like, when you look at sort of Gen Z, which is everyone under 24, and sort of Gen Alpha, which is everyone under 13, like they are going to have a bigger generational disruption than anyone. I think even a bigger generational disruption than like millennials who sort of essentially grew up with the internet, because they're like, Gen Alpha, Gen Z, like, they are native users of TikTok, of UGC, of generative AI. Like, as I said, they've got the financial firepower, like in terms of their ability to pay. Like, they are default creator, not default consumer, like, which is a huge, huge shift. Like, and I really think almost everyone is underthinking this. I have a general bias around, like, so for anyone listening to this on the game development side, like anyone who is working on product that is going to interface with, people under the age of 24, like, I don't think this is legal, to be clear, but I feel that everyone should have kids. Like, it's a remarkable. I mean, this has changed a bit in the Valley, like, and with sort of general tech, but like, it's amazing how many like tools and services for parents, or for kids for that matter, are built by people who are not parents or do not have kids, right? And that to me seems kind of nuts. So that would be a thing. I think people should spend a lot of time looking at what everyone else is doing. I mean, I talked about what Epic has done with cabinet accounts, which again, my association aside, like, I really think was a benchmark in terms of like, how do you support young audiences in a way that doesn't block them out? Like, that was very, very cool. And I think the third point is everyone has to move away from, assuming that young audiences don't equate to revenue. And, I'm blunt enough to be able to say that, in those terms. But I think like the organizational politics that I've seen developers run into when they're trying to have conversations like this, they often just get shot down with some version of that sentence. And it's like, hey, these are real consumers. They want to be considered consumers. They want to interact. They value your content. They want to be able to pay for things. Like, treat them as like, treat them with that level of respect. So I think those are sort of off the top of my head and somewhat flippantly, some things I would think about. But definitely, like, make sure your product teams have actual parents on them. That's a real thing.
Sounds like good advice. Well, I want to switch gears again, this time to the realm of user-generated content. And first question I want to ask is just, why has this corner of the industry caught your attention lately? And what are you most enamored by just as you spend more time looking at it?
I mean, I spend time looking at lots of things, I suppose, but like, I don't think it's caught my attention recently. Like, I mean, for me, at least my definition of UGC probably goes back to like PC mods back in the late 90s. Yeah. To me, that's all kind of UGC. I mean, I think the fascination I have with UGC platforms at the moment is sort of like the combination of that with like the uniqueness of this audience that we're seeing, right? The sort of the Gen Z, Gen Alpha audience, like everyone under 24. Like, so it isn't really just about creation, because we kind of content creation, because we had that before. It's not just about distribution, because that was kind of there before. Like, it's about the fact that like you actually now also have like real monetization opportunities for creators, combined with all of these things, like it's kind of breaking down like the sort of the historical barriers with professional kind of content creation. I mean, we've seen that with video, obviously, for a long time. But the fact that we're now seeing it across games, like at a moment where, like, hours spent gaming are now roughly the same as sort of, online video, streaming video. Um, and, post COVID, you're sort of seeing the displacement of all the social activity moving into gaming. Like, I think, Charlie Munger, if he was still alive, like, would call this sort of the Lollapalooza effect, like where you've just got all of these things happening at the same time, like in this massively sort of overlapping phenomena. And it's all sort of being localized within Roblox and within Fortnite and within a couple of other places. So I just think it's a fascinating confluence of factors, both demographic and technical and distribution, that I don't think we've seen before, and it makes me intrigued and excited about a lot of different things. And I suppose also having been in Epic for the last 3 years and had a ringside seat to it, it's hard not to be.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that, specifically UEFN. We've covered this across a few episodes and Navic Digest, and obviously it's only about 9 months after launch, so still very early days for the platform. But it appears to be off to somewhat a slow start. But I'm curious, kind of even just like early performance aside, like what are your early impressions of this platform?
So UEFN, yeah, look, I mean, my very honest assessment of it is that it's still, I mean, as you say, it's still early. I mean, the more accurate technical term is probably very early, right? Like, I mean, I think, a lot of people sort of can't help but compare it to Roblox, but like, I just think that's kind of totally the wrong thing. I mean, Roblox has had like, what, 16, 18 years of development?
Yeah.
Like, and I think what the team in Epic have pulled together in UEFN, like, is remarkable given sort of the relatively short gestation period. I think it, to me, I mean, again, this is absolutely my opinion and not Epic's, but like, UEFN is really about building titles for the Fortnite community. Like, so I feel, and I mean, I guess a bunch of people do this, but I do think it makes more sense to compare it to Steam in that respect rather than Roblox, right? Like, I think, Roblox, obviously it doesn't have its origins as a game. Like, it is a much more kind of casual game platform. Like, I suspect everyone is probably going to like undervalue UEFN for probably quite a while until a Smash emerges, right? Like, and I think the interesting, like, the Lego Fortnite game, which is coming out, like, is in many respects, I think is kind of a preview of what's going to be possible for UEFN, right? And again, yeah, hopefully by the time this airs, that sentence will have totally made sense. But I think that, like, it is very much an audience play, and the power of the Fortnite audience, which we've kind of seen, like with the recent resurgence from OG, like is very, very real. And I think the same was sort of true with sort of Steam in the early days. But I feel it will just take time. I mean, it's been out, like, what did you say, 9 months? Like,
yeah,
it's, developers are still only just getting their hands around it. Like, there's still a lot of features to be rolled out. I think you've got to look at it probably over at least a 2-year time frame, before you can really sort of give it an assessment. But I wouldn't, like, I definitely wouldn't underestimate them. I think everyone will, but I wouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it just seems like the typical hype cycle that you see with, many new technologies, many new products. People get very enamored by the idea of what something can be
Yeah.
faster than it can actually become that thing that people are excited about. And then there's a
Yeah.
building period, and then it gets there eventually. And I think I'm with you that that'll probably be the case here. And it's really exciting what they're doing. I also wanted to ask, when you look long term at what this platform can be, especially since you spent some time in Epic, how do you think it will be unique or different, and kind of like mark its own stamp compared to a Roblox in order to kind of chart its own path, be its own way? Like you mentioned, being for the Fortnite community, like, that's one difference. But what are maybe a couple other differences that kind of shape how you think about it longer term?
I mean, I think this is probably going to depend on um, other things which have not yet been decided. I mean, I think, and I mean, this is very much me speaking with my advertising hat. And I think if Tim was here, he would definitely not agree with this statement. But like, there is, I think, when you think about like the distribution of Fortnite, like it is so penetrated on consoles. Like, whereas Roblox, is about roughly 75% mobile. Like, if I'm an advertiser, like the notion of like being able to appear on sort of big giant screens is many, many, many times more compelling than appearing like on a small little smartphone screen, right? And so when you think about whether it's sort of like how brands show up, or integrations or things like that, like as a sort of a an exhibition stage for brands, I think that's long term going to be very, very interesting to see how that plays out versus Roblox. I do think that like the nature of the nature of the audience will determine, I think, the nature of the biggest games. And so it's not going to, and again, when we look at what's going to be sort of launching on the platform soon, and the sorts of things that have been hits, like I could absolutely believe that there will be some extremely large games that might look like Battle Royale that will come out, and that would be good and that would be healthy. I think whether you know it, I think people sometimes position the two on a fidelity level, in the sense of like it's sort of UE versus Roblox, right? From a visual fidelity, I mean, perspective. I don't know whether that's going to matter or not, right? And historically, like games have never let like visual fidelity get in the way of popularity, right? Um, but I do think that like the tools are definitely there, with UEFN and the distribution, like particularly onto console. I do think we've gotten to the point where everyone is probably as I'm saying this again, I think everyone's underestimating Epic, and by extension underestimating UEFN with where this can go. I mean, I would say broadly actually about both like UEFN and Roblox, like that, everyone is also underestimating how long these platforms will be around for. Like, I don't like if you were to consider building a competitor to Fortnite or to Roblox today, like it's not impossible to do, but it's getting increasingly impossible to do. Right? No matter how much capital you were to throw at that, like the ability to try to break through all of the noise and get to the scale of either of those companies. I mean, Roblox is what, about 70 million DAO. Like Fortnite was about what, 45 million last weekend. Like, it's they were able to do things in their history that are simply not possible today or in the future. So I do feel that like that there is a moat that is being created, that is actually getting bigger. And again, I think people are probably underestimating that long term, and I think that's going to be a factor for both of those platforms.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. I saw a few months ago when I was looking at the Roblox numbers, their R&D run rate recently tipped $1 billion just for new R&D, not even considering all the things that they've built over the past couple decades. And there are basically very few companies, very, very, very few companies that can compete on that level to ever even have a chance of catching up. And those that can probably won't. So yeah, I think that moat is real. It's interesting to hear you say that people are underestimating kind of the long-term potential of these platforms and how long they'll be around. Roblox is a $25 billion company. And it seems like, at least in investor circles, there's a lot of sentiment around like, it's so expensive, like, and to me, I'm just like, yeah, but kind of like the thing that would make Roblox still be like a great investment from here is that longevity piece. It's being able to grow faster for longer than everyone else is thinking. So I think I'm pretty maybe aligned with you on just that longevity side, and it even just being potentially being underestimated in more ways than one. But I want to get your thoughts on Roblox too. You can comment on that, but also just anything else related to Roblox that like has your particular attention right now. I'd be curious about.
I mean, I think like, the sheer time being spent there, by Gen Alpha and Gen Z, like, and I mean, this is true in Fortnite as well, I suppose, but I guess Roblox talks about it much more. They have to, they're public, and the displacement of the activity, right? Like, and how it's sort of managing to sort of aggregate a lot of different habits there. Like, and I think, we are probably, I think both from Fortnite and from Roblox. I mean, this gets fully into prediction territory. Like, you are going to see the emergence of, like, if you go 10 years from now and you look at like, one or two of maybe the top 20 most valuable consumer companies, I would be willing to bet that one or two of those will have emerged from something in either Fortnite or Roblox, right? Whether that's like some sort of game that's been built, or an experience that's been built, or a process that was being enabled there. Like, I just, going back to the Lollapalooza effect that we're seeing, right? I just think, like, these are these places have like the density of activity and the density of talent, and they've got the distribution. And I this is where, I mean, if I was, I guess Sam Altman doesn't run Y Combinator anymore, but like, this is where I would be fishing for like the next generation of like very, very interesting startups. And I think, like, in the way that sort of Starbucks sort of like was always seen as the perpetual home of like founders getting together and sort of actually figuring out the company they were going to build, I could believe that Roblox is going to be that, and Fortnite maybe to a slightly lesser degree, but like both of those, like over the next few years. I mean, I think there's a whole topic which we should talk about around advertising in both of these platforms, but you maybe want to punt that until later on.
Yeah, well, I'm just curious. You mentioned just young people and just like a younger generation of entrepreneurs. Um, I'm so curious to see what, young Gen Z, Gen Alpha, how they view building and in the games industry and around the games industry just differently from what we have seen so far. And I think we're starting to get like the tip of the spear of what that could look like with these platforms. But
Yep.
you are an investor. You're looking at these spaces. You've obviously spent a lot of time around kid tech and such that kind of relates to this to some degree. What are you looking for, in terms of like differentiated founders, differentiated ideas, like just like what is different from the past that is like extra interesting, potentially being built on these platforms or in this space?
I mean, I don't know if it's, I think what's different to the past, or at least different to the recent past, as I've said, is the nature of the audience, right? Like, the fact that you now have, this is a general point, but it's generally true. Like, almost everyone under the age of 24 is a default creator of some type, right? It is not just, if you go at least probably like 30 plus, 35 plus, people's kind of default pattern with content is just to consume, and I think that is absolutely a huge difference. I mean, I think that, like, you are also seeing, for everyone sort of under the age of probably mostly kind of Gen Z, right? As they are growing up and hitting 18 and being able to sort of, do more commercial things, they are growing up in an environment where interest rates are 5.5%, right? Whereas all the millennials mostly kind of grew up or came of age like in sort of ZERP, right? In zero interest environment. So I think that's a point that will probably take some time to emerge, in terms of the differing sort of financial environments and what that means for building business. I think because like a lot of people, a lot of sort of, let's say 20 something founders that I talk to like today, they are very comfortable hacking on different things and trying and trying and trying and trying and realizing they don't need much capital to do it. I mean, I think that like the amount of capital to start a company has been decreasing pretty consistently, maybe almost exponentially over the last few years. But like it really doesn't take much. And again, that has sort of coincided with a bit of an anti-VC rhetoric that you're hearing. Like, as a lot of stuff kind of goes sideways and sort of, people blame VCs for giving them too much money, and which I think is a little bit disingenuous, but however. So I think you're seeing like the emergence of sort of a new class of company builder that is like a curious mix of like both extremely ethical and extremely capitalist at the same time. And I'm not sure where that goes. Um, but it is sort of fascinating to look for. I mean, as I said, I spend a lot of time sort of trying to look for things that are obviously true, and then also trying to avoid doing stupid things. So as a result, I invest in very, very few opportunities. But like, it is kind of, and this sort of comes back to the acquisition conversation as well. It is about looking at founder values, like, and how do they think about incentives? How is their determination and energy? How are they about kind of costs and like responsibility to money? And then unit economics and sort of cash flow models and things like that. And I would then also say, I mean, I guess I sort of implied this all the way through, but the one big difference that I'm seeing with all the conversations is that everyone realizes that they have to build profitable things now. It is not, and even 3 years ago, and I'm sure you've seen this through lots of your conversations too, like everyone was sort of default, okay, I'm going to raise, pre-seed, and then I'm going to do seed, and then I'm going to do Series A, and like half the presentation is their schedule of when they're going to raise external capital. Whereas now it's, everyone knows what EBITDA stands for. Which is cool. So I that's about as much as I can say about what I'm seeing or what I think I'm seeing. I think in terms of the new generation of founders, it's very cool. I learn a lot from them.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited to see what this new generation looks like. I do think there are going to be quite a few differences, just in terms of like where they come from the platforms that they use, both like device wise, but also that like the games are built on, how socialization works, how the creator mindset works. It's just there's so many things that like add up to just being different in terms of how your worldview or your industry view would shape up as a builder.
I think there's also like I'm seeing in a few other spaces like a lot of hybrid business models. Like people are not afraid to sort of, for example, people are building sort of product companies, and they are thinking very, very early on almost about like what would be sort of a merchant media strategy, as in like they're spinning up sort of an ad or a brand business around the product, like almost like very, very early on, as in, hey, we have customers who are coming in to buy this. We should also be able to deliver them some kind of brand engagement or ads. And it's sort of Eric Seufert's line, right? Everything is an ad network.
I was literally just thinking that. Yeah.
Yeah. Great minds. Shout out to Eric, by the way. He's great. But it's interesting that people are completely comfortable running these kind of hybrid models. Or you see it elsewhere, like in music, where sort of, you might get creative agencies that then also are spinning up music labels and signing artists, and all sort of doing this within sort of like one kind of entity. It's fascinating.
Yeah, well, we got to start wrapping up now. So I have 3 final rapid fire questions for you. One is just, what else in the games industry are you excited about? It could be a game, could be a company, could be a trend. What else is piquing your interest today?
What else is piquing my interest? I am looking forward to seeing the reaction to everything that Lego is doing with Epic, um, because I think that represents a lot of work, but B, a lot of very sort of long term thinking. By a company that has not historically done much has done a lot in the game space, but not quite as strategically as it is here. So I think that's kind of cool. I am looking forward to seeing like what a lot of the startup new apparel brands do with gaming. So like you see all the big sort of like, Gucci and various sort of big luxury brands doing things there. But like I'm fascinated to look at like what, Hoodrich and Trapstar and Cortez and all these sort of like interesting new sort of, urban labels start to do about gaming, because they have built all of their businesses mostly around TikTok and influencer and video. And like, so much of that world, music as well, has kind of not ignored gaming, but just hasn't quite figured out what to do. And I think that's kind of cool. I am kind of very interested still by like, how the world of brands and advertising finally cracks UGC platforms. Like for roughly 15 years, everyone has been talking about sort of some version of in-game ads, right? And no one has really made that work. And I've had hundreds, possibly literally thousands of meetings with agencies who are like, "Hey, how do we reach the gaming audience?" And no one has really been able to solve that. And I think where, like, looking at where Roblox is going with a lot of that, I think they are starting to put like the rails in place to maybe make that a little bit scalable. I think it's still very, very early, but that is a thing that I feel has some degree of inevitability to it. It's hard to call the timing on that, and if I look at presentations on in-game advertising from like 2007, they look exactly like the ones I see today, which is kind of funny. So I think that's pretty fascinating. I am sort of kind of intrigued by VR, just because like I'm sure you've had lots of versions of these conversations where everyone sort of says, yeah, it's definitely going to be a thing in 10 years. Definitely, definitely, definitely. And nobody knows how we get there. Nobody. And I just don't know what that means. But it still sort of sits there as a thing I scratch my head about every so often. And then I think finally, I'm still like challenged by how I find more time. I need a more compressed way of playing games that isn't just watching them at like, more greater than 1x speed. That's just not fun. That's still like I have a problem that sort of looks like that kind of shape. So that's probably my immediate list.
No, those are great. I think I'm aligned on a lot of those as being exciting. Next, what are a couple book recommendations you'd have for our audience? You're a big reader. I know you read a lot about businesses, business history, that type of thing. Any favorites you want to shout out?
Oh, I mean, I have so many. I think, let's see, what should people read? I think if people haven't read the Intel Trinity, which is sort of the original, the history of Intel, which everyone's probably eye rolling and going, semiconductors, really? But like it really is the foundation of so much of Silicon Valley. Like it really, really is worth reading. I think the other thing that's very good is the Power Law, which is sort of it's actually, they're quite good to read side by side, because it's sort of the history of VC, and it kind of goes back to the investment behind Intel, actually, and everything that came after through the 70s and 80s. And it also it's a great book for founders to read, so that they can kind of truly understand how like the business of investing works. And I've always sort of like gotten quite a lot from that. And then I would also say, just as a general like piece of advice, given the week that's in it, like there's a couple of very famous speeches that Charlie Munger gave. They're all sitting around YouTube. One was I don't think it was a commencement speech, but there's one. It's on YouTube. Go and listen to that, and bookmark it, and set a reminder to listen to it once a year. Like, it's basically about his he was a collector of human biases, and he lists them, and like, just, examples in history and in business of where these showed up. And it's just, you can, that guy was just one of the wisest human beings, like that we've had exposure to. So he really is worth spending time. So those would be my rapid fire. But I mean, I'm on Goodreads in public, so people should hit me up if they want recommendations.
Yeah, I'll have to check out those books. I also feel like the games industry is kind of insular sometimes, and more people should study other industries, because you just learn so much. It's
a really good point. I complain about that a lot. Like, there's a lot of other places out there that have figured out a lot of these things before, and not every wheel needs to be reinvented.
Yeah. Well, final question for you, Dylan, is for people who want to follow along with your writing, your reading, your ongoing thoughts, where should they go?
If you don't mind some fairly raw, unvarnished thoughts, I mean, I write stuff on dylancollins.com. I'm on Twitter, X, Threads, LinkedIn, all the obvious places. Just search for me, and you'll kind of find me. But I veer around in terms of topics. I don't stick specifically to like youth or digital or gaming. It is pretty broad. So if you're into eclectic stuff, there I am.
Well, I've enjoyed it. DylanCollins.com. But let's go ahead and wrap up there. Dylan, I really enjoyed getting to learn more about what you've achieved and what you're thinking about. So thanks for hopping on, and best wishes and everything you dream up next. If you enjoyed today's episode, whether on YouTube or your favorite podcast app, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, or give a 5-star review. And if you want to reach out or provide feedback, shoot us a note at podcast@naavik.co, or find us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Plus, if you want to learn more about what Naavik has to offer, make sure to check out our website, www.naavik.co. There, you can sign up for the #1 games industry newsletter, Naavik Digest, or contact us to learn about our wide-ranging consulting and advisory services. Again, that is www.naavik.co. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.